Between 167 and 103 BCE, Judea transformed from a persecuted backwater on the edge of the Seleucid Empire to a fully independent expansionist kingdom, the first Jewish kingdom since the destruction of the First Temple nearly 5 centuries earlier. As a result, a general understanding of Judean administration is key to understanding the era that followed. It is important to note that the Judean government was not static. Many of the practices and institutions described in this video date as far back as the Davidic period. Others continued for centuries after the Roman conquests, and all of them underwent at least some constitutional changes over time. This video will explain how the Jewish government worked during the Hasmonean and Herodian dynasties, but keep in mind that most of what I described did not begin or end there. By law, all Jews were automatically eligible to become Judean citizens. This included not only those living in Judea, but all Jews living in diaspora, which by the Hasmonean period were the majority. Judea also had a large number of non-Jews, who were eligible for citizenship on the condition that they serve in the army, but most chose not to do this. The Judean army was a citizen army, which fought in Greek-style phalanxes. Jewish men were required to serve during wartime, with only archers and cavalry serving as full-time professional soldiers. Exempt from service were the Kohanim, priests and those in line to become priests, as they were not supposed to touch dead bodies. But exempt does not mean prohibited, and many Kohanim volunteered for combat. Judea didn't have a navy. Despite its economic reliance on maritime trade and world-renowned shipbuilding industry, Judea's straight coastline and geographic location between the land-based powers of Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Egypt made maritime invasion unlikely, and merchant vessels could reliably depend on protection from piracy by the Roman navy. Jews did not believe in owning private property within their kingdom. The Torah dictated that all land belonged to God, and thus all property rights were theoretically held by the state on his behalf. In practice, this made little difference. Even if one didn't own the land, one did own any structures built on that land, as well as any tools or animals used to work the land, and were entitled to the profits from the land. However, Jews were forbidden from harvesting crops that grew on the far corners of their fields, which had to be left aside as an offering to the poor and travelers and anyone who might find themselves in the area in need of food. Because nobody owned the land, taxation was based on income. This was a stark contrast to the Roman Republic, who levied taxes based on the estimated value of privately owned land. As Judea and Rome grew politically ever closer, this disparity in methods of taxation would eventually boil over into violence. The Judean government comprised 5 parts: the civil tribunals, the lesser Sanhedrim, the great Sanhedrin, the monarchy, and the high priesthood. Any Jewish community of size, whether in Judea or beyond, would have had a synagogue. The Hebrew word for synagogue is Bet Knesset, literally meeting house. These locations served not only religious purposes, but acted as a court for property disputes, marriage and divorce, and other civil matters. Civil trials were administered by a tribunal of 3 local rabbis, men of knowledge both religious and secular. During the interdynastic period, rabbis were educated through apprenticeships. But this was changed during the Hasmonean dynasty with the establishment of rabbinical academies, or yeshivot. Although we think of rabbis today as religious leaders, their main goal was, and theoretically still is, to interpret and enforce Jewish law. By this mechanism, Judea was one of the first polities in the world to embrace the concept of case law, or precedent law. None of the other classical powers had a concept of legal precedent, and it wouldn't gain wider acceptance until medieval England. Within the Kingdom of Judea, each city with a large enough Jewish population was governed by a district court called a Sanhedrin. These Sanhedrim, each comprising panels of 23 rabbis, presided over criminal cases in their local jurisdictions. They also acted as an appeals court for civil matters, and were responsible for electing a local representative to the Great Sanhedrin. The Great Sanhedrin was both the legislative body and the Supreme Court of Judea, though it had already existed before the Maccabean Revolt. The Great Sanhedrin was in charge of levying taxes, making adjustments to the Hebrew calendar, voting on proposed laws, appointing regional governors, and declaring war. It met in a half-dome chamber of the temple complex called the Hall of Hewn Stone, and had 71 members, 2 from Jerusalem and 1 from every other city in the kingdom. During the Hasmonean period, the Great Sanhedrin was divided into 2 political parties. The Sadducees were wealthier, less religious, and supported a more powerful monarchy and priesthood. Its supporters generally included the secular and priestly aristocracy, from which it gets its name, as high priests were often known as Kohanei Tzadok. The Pharisees were more religious, and believed that the monarchy and priesthood should be less powerful, instead preferring the Sanhedrin itself as the primary authority in matters both civic and spiritual. Their supporters tended to come from Judea's emerging middle class of merchants and artisans, as well as those Jews who lived in areas only recently conquered by Judea. For this reason, they also supported greater tolerance for non-Jewish minorities living in the new territories. The Pharisees were the majority party for most of the Hasmonean period. Their support was strongest in the Galilee, a region which had been majority Jewish for centuries, but only became part of the kingdom in 103 BCE. The leader of the majority party was called the Nasi, or president, though today we would more appropriately use the term prime minister. The minority leader served as the Av Bet Din, or chief justice of the Sanhedrin, during criminal trials. Only the most serious crimes in the kingdom were brought before the Great Sanhedrin, like murder, treason, and war crimes, and only the Great Sanhedrin could issue a death sentence. This implies that death sentences in Judea were actually pretty rare. Capital offenses were typically only tried around the pilgrimage festivals of Pesach, Shavuot, or Sukkot, as those were the only times during which all 71 members of the Sanhedrin were in attendance. For this reason, the pilgrimage festivals were a popular time for political dissidents to make themselves heard. It is not hyperbole to say that the Sanhedrin was the most important instrument of Jewish law and religious practice. The list of men who held the positions of Nasi and Av Bet Din were known collectively as the Zugot, or pairs, and their deliberations still hold a special place in Judaism as the origin of rabbinic literature. But neither they nor the Sanhedrin itself acted alone. The monarch of Judea was the national head of state, charged with approving or vetoing bills passed by the Sanhedrin. The monarch was also commander-in-chief of the Judean army and served as a national figurehead. In reality, the powers of the monarch really depended on how much clout said monarch could wield over the Great Sanhedrin. When John Hyrcanus attempted to depose the Pharisees from power, he discovered that this was an empty gesture, as the Pharisees were the majority party, and opposition Sadducee policy lacked the confidence of the legislature. On the other hand, a monarch who could cooperate with, or even further empower the Sanhedrin, could massively strengthen Judea as a whole, and turn it into a serious international player. The high priest was in charge of running the temple in Jerusalem, regulating Jewish religious practices, and also had the power to veto a declaration of war. Originally, the high priesthood was a hereditary position passed from father to son, but this turned out to be a problem. Throughout the Hasmonean period, the positions of king and high priest were usually held by the same person, emphasis on king. This was a major point of opposition by the Pharisees, as not only was combat ritually impure, but the indefinite nature of military campaigns often left the priest-kings unable to perform their duties at the temple. Eventually, the high priesthood was reformed into an appointed position, to be nominated by the monarch and confirmed by the Great Sanhedrin, though eligibility for the high priesthood remained hereditary. If you want to know more about the priesthood, you can check out my video on how the Jewish temple worked. In large part, the constitutional reforms of the Hasmonean dynasty were an attempt to emulate Rome. The result was one of the most modern forms of government in the classical world, arguably more so than Rome or Athens. You may have noticed that many of the ideas in the Constitution of Judea are also present in the modern state of Israel. So it is all the more impressive that those similarities are mostly coincidental, driven by modern ideologies like socialism and parliamentary republicanism. For the most part, the early Zionist movement was a reaction against Jewish religious tradition, so most of the commonalities present today exist despite the tradition rather than because of it. This movement towards more Roman and Greek institutions is also reflected in Jewish art at the time. Even synagogues began having lively frescoes and mosaics. And whereas Torah Judaism had historically eschewed great monuments, the tombs and fortresses of Judea at this time were full of grand towers with arches, Ionian columns, and pyramids, an eclectic style that was also in vogue in Rome at that time. Jewish monarchs also began going exclusively by their Greek names upon taking the throne. Hyrcanus, Aristobulus, Alexander, and Alexandra had been born Yohanan, Yehuda, Yehonatan, and Shlomzion. What had begun generations earlier as an independence movement against foreign influence had become far more foreign than old Matthew Maccabee could have possibly imagined. Special thanks to my patrons, including Gaonit level patron Vicky Nelson. If you like this video, you can also donate via Patreon link below. You can also check out my book, An Armada of Cats Travels in Israel, along with links to my sources for this video. Otherwise, you can always like, share, and subscribe. I will see you next time.